previous part of this series, we talked about the manuscripts, the textual witnesses, and what changes were made unintentionally. Before that, however, in part 5 of the Canon of this video series about the Comma Johanneum, we had already considered in detail 1 John chapter 5 verses 7 and 8, a very famous example of an intentional change. Was this a rare exception? As early as the 2nd century, a pagan critic of Christians named Celsus argued that Christians change their text entirely as they see fit. Interestingly, Origenes, Christian, did not deny this in his rebuttal, but spoke of a large number of differences in the manuscripts of the Gospels. A little over a century later, Pope Damasus was so concerned about the differences in the Latin manuscripts of the New Testament that he commissioned Jerome to produce a standardized text, which then became part of, or the predecessor of, the Vulgata, the Vulgate. And already he had to compare different manuscripts in Latin and Greek that differed from each other. Today we want to get an overview of deliberate mistakes and other changes, so that we have a good idea what happened and to which extent. So let's start with deliberate mistakes. Some changes were inserted when copying a manuscript because it was believed that the marginal note, a gloss or insertion between the lines was not an additional comment, but actually belonged in the text. And some of these are still found in current translations and are not always indicated by a footnote. For example, let's have a look here in Revelation 25. You can read here, "The rest of the dead did not come back to life until the 1,000 years were complete. This is the first resurrection." That's Revelation 25 according to BSB. However, the first sentence, the first part here, the rest, blah, 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 until we're complete, the first sentence is missing in Codex Sinaiticus, in Codex Vaticanus, and the Aramaic texts. And I link an article which explains that in more detail. This was the translators of the 2001 translation note to that text here. This familiar description of the resurrection has been quoted for years and used as a basis for many religious doctrines. However, the words shown here in our presentation in italics above are found in the Bible's oldest Greek manuscript of the Revelation. So it's not found there in the Codex Sinaiticus, nor are they found in the oldest Aramaic manuscript, the Caburis Codex. Therefore, they appear to be a later, spurious addition to the Bible, and this is why we have chosen to cross them out. They are probably some ancient preacher's personal notes which he had written between the lines. They were likely moved into the main text by later copyists who couldn't tell if they were part of the original text or not. Comment by a translator of the 2001 translation. But we will see now that you can be misled, or that someone can mislead the reader even a bit more. Let's compare this. So now we have in brackets, "The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended." This is the first resurrection. And we also have, "Therefore, when you catch sight of the disgusting thing that causes desolation, as spoken about by Daniel the prophet, standing in a holy place," and then we also have the brackets, "let the reader use discernment." Actually, that was Revelation 25 and Matthew 24:15 in the New World Translation. Who once has read the insertion in brackets in Matthew 24:15 will assume in Revelation 25 in the same translation that is just as much an insertion in the translation. After all, in the Old New World Translation, one could still read in the footnote, the rest of the dead, ... 1,000 years were ended. And then they quote AVG, the Vulgate, and missing in Aleph, Syrian, in the current, so that one can see that it is not in those manuscripts. By the way, in the current edition of the New World Translation, this footnote is missing. Revelation 25 is just very important for the teachings of Jehovah's Witnesses. However, the first part, which is not included in the oldest manuscripts and is later found in various places as a marginal note in some manuscripts, cannot be considered as certain. And therefore, it's a good example that one should be very careful when a certain teaching is based on only one text. Now we want to continue to get an overview of intentional changes. Indeed, there were intentional changes. And the examples which I now cite and show you from different translations are from Barty Ehrman's Misquoting Jesus, this book. Let's start with Mark 1, verses 2 and 3, where we read, "As it is written in Isaiah, the prophet, I will send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way." The problem is that it's not only Isaiah which is quoted here, but also Malachi and Genesis. That is why some writers have changed it in some manuscripts to "as it is written in the prophets." And if you want to verify that, you can still see it in the King James Bible, for example, even today. Another example is Matthew 24:36. Let's compare these two translations. "But concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only." And the other translation says, "But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only." This was ESV, English Standard Version, on top, which has the words "nor the Son," and it's the New King James Version, which is similar to the King James Version, which doesn't have it. So some writers must have wondered how this could be. The Son of God does not know? Is he not also omniscient? The text was probably also used as an argument against the Trinity. And that was what they wanted to prevent. And so the part "not even the Son" was left out in some manuscripts. In Matthew 17:12-13, some copyists wanted to prevent the misunderstanding that John the Baptist was the Son of Man. And if you read the context, you will understand that you can misinterpret it. And so they added the explanation. His disciples recognized that he was speaking to them about John the Baptist. A whole series of other changes were made so that the text could not be used by so-called heretics. For example, this one in Luke 5:38-39. According to NIV, we read, "No, new wine must be poured into new wineskins, and no one after drinking old wine wants the new, for they say the old is better." Why was this a problem? When in the 2nd century there was a current among the Christians who were convinced, or movement among the Christians who were convinced that the old religion of the Jews was completely overtaken by the new religion of the Christians. And the conclusion of this text was suspicious to them. How could Jesus say that the old wine is better than the new one? And so some copyists simply left out the last part. The old is better. For some copyists, it was also not enough that Jesus is not called the son of Joseph in Matthew 1:16. Instead of Joseph being Mary's husband, they changed the text so that he was only the fiancé. Jesus was not allowed to have a human father in any case. Another point, when an ascetic lifestyle became more important to some Christians, they added few words in Mark 9:29. And we see it here in different translations. And he said to them, "This kind is able to go out by nothing except by prayer." That's Berean literal Bible. But New King James Version says, "So he said to them, this kind can come out by nothing but prayer and fasting." So they added "and fasting" because that fit to their ascetic lifestyle. One of the most famous liturgical changes is that of the Lord's Prayer in Luke. The prayer in Luke seems hopelessly abbreviated compared to the more familiar words in Matthew 6, 9-13. So copyists have harmonized the text in Luke and simply inserted parts from Matthew into Luke. In some translations, even today, you can read an account that reminds you more of the Apocrypha. For example, John 5:3-4. In these lay a multitude of those who were sick, blind, lame, and withered, waiting for the moving of the waters. For an angel of the Lord went down at certain seasons into the pool and stirred up the water. Whoever then first, after the stirring up of the water, stepped in was made well from whatever disease which he was afflicted. That's in the New American Standard Bible, NASB, 1995. But in the oldest and best manuscripts, there is no movement of the water and the reason for it. Due to the oral tradition, this part was added later by copyists. According to the oldest and best manuscripts, we read only this. Here, a great number of disabled people used to lie: the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. John chapter 5, 3 and 4, according to NIV, according to the oldest and best manuscripts. However, there are other intentional changes to the text that have a greater impact on the central message and the teachings of the text. Jesus Christ was full of love and compassion, wasn't it? For example, Mark 1:41 says, "Moved with compassion, Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. 'I'm willing,' he said, 'be clean.'" Mark 1:41 BSB. Many will know the text and it probably touches us all. But in another translation we can read, Jesus was indignant instead of compassion, having compassion. Jesus was indignant. He reached out his hand and touched the man. "I'm willing," he said, "be clean." That was NIV. In one of the oldest textual witnesses, however, the Codex Bezae, and 3 Latin manuscripts, we thus find the word, in Greek, orgistes, to be angry, instead of the Greek word splagnistes, to have compassion. Based on the textual witnesses, we can assume that this textual variant dates back to the 2nd century. But can it be that Jesus is angry or resentful? He is never portrayed that way in Luke and Matthew. Many scholars assume that Mark was a source for both books, Luke and Matthew. But even when they do give a fairly accurate account of the text from Mark, it omits that Jesus was angry. But also in Mark 3 verse 5 we can read that he looked around them with anger. And according to Mark 10:14, he was even angry or displeased with his disciples. Both Matthew and Luke report the same thing, but without mentioning Jesus' feelings. And finally, according to Mark 1:43, he also snapped at, threatened or sternly rebuked the sick man. Could it be that our image of Jesus is too much influenced by the Gospel of Matthew and Luke, and especially John then? And we ignore the nature of Jesus according to the Gospel of Mark? We would not be the first one to do so. Some copyists in the earliest history of Christianity changed the text of the manuscripts because of this. Thus, Jesus is portrayed in Luke's Gospel as being unshakable by anything, except for this prayer in the Mount of Olives, according to Luke 22, verses 39 to 46, saying, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." Now an angel from heaven appeared to him, strengthening him, and being in agony, he was praying very fervently, and his sweat became like drops of blood falling down upon the ground. When he rose from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping from sorrow. That's Luke 22, verses 42 to 45 NASB. However, in some of the oldest and best manuscripts, the Alexandrian texts, the crossed out words are not found, but in some other ancient textual witnesses. Therefore, scholars are still debating whether these words are from Luke or not. And even though this text may not affect any central dogma, it changes the picture of Jesus considerably. And there were already very, very early different versions of this gospel. And also in Hebrews 2, 8 to 9, verses 8 and 9, a teaching about Jesus' death is involved. But we do see Jesus, who was made lower than the angels for a little while, now crowned with glory and honor because he suffered death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. By the grace of God. That's what we read in the NIV. Most of the textual witnesses contain the idea that Jesus suffered death by the grace of God. But what does that mean? But in some other textual witnesses, it says that Jesus died separated from God. And Origenes writes in the early 3rd century that this was found in most manuscripts of his time. I wonder what was in the autograph. We don't know. And not even Origenes in the early 3rd century could figure it out. Both variants have interesting theological consequences. In the context of this series, let us note, it is an example of a text where we do not know what is right from the 3rd century until today. The text has not been handed down to us by God in a clear and certain way. And as a last part, we have intentional, theologically motivated changes to the text. So let us give us just a few more examples of intentional changes to the text, where we can see which view among Christians this was directed against. These different currents or movements and their importance for the developments of the canon of Christian scriptures will be discussed in a later part of this series. Let's start with the first, against the today's so-called dynamic monarchianism or adaptionism. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries, there were a number of Christian groups that advocated dynamic monarchianism or adoptionism. And you can see more details in Wikipedia or in Barty Ehrman's book. The best known group was that of the Judeo-Christian sect of the Ebionites, the Ebioniten. For one thing, they insisted that all followers of Jesus must also become Jews. They were also strict monotheists in the sense that for them only God the Father could have a divine nature. Jesus did not exist as a man before his birth. That's what they believed. He was adopted by God as a son at his baptism because of his special righteousness. Because of this faithfulness to the point of death on the cross, God rewarded him by raising him up and exalting him to heaven. That's what they believed. This, however, contradicted the developing doctrine of the Trinity held by we could call it proto-Orthodox Church. Therefore, some changed the text of 1 Timothy 3:16 in a way that can be found even today in the Bibles. And without controversy, great is the mystery of godliness. God was manifest in flesh. God was manifest in flesh, justified in the Spirit, seen of angels, preached unto the Gentiles, believed on in the world, received up in the glory. That's 1 Timothy 3:16 according to the King James Version. In the earliest manuscripts, however, such as the Codex Alexandrinus, this is found. By common confession, the mystery of godliness is great. He appeared in the flesh, was vindicated by the Spirit, was seen by angels, was proclaimed among the nations, was believed in throughout the world, was taken up in glory. 1 Timothy 3:16 BSB. From he, which clearly referred Jesus according to the context, it became God. So it was changed from he to God. In Greek, there's only a slight difference. And you can see it here. The slight difference is from here, the omega sigma, to the theta sigma. It's just this small line. And this is the abbreviation for theos, God. But it came about that many Christians over nearly 2,000 years found in the text the idea that God was revealed in the flesh. Since this is a central doctrine of the Christian churches, this has not been a minor change. For similar reasons, you can still find this today. And Joseph and his mother marveled at those things which were spoken of him. Luke 2:33 according to King James Version. Whereas in many other translations you can read, and this is NIV, the child's father and mother marveled at what was said about him. A large number of copyists substituted father for Joseph because they wanted to avoid giving the impression that Jesus had a human father, which would have helped the adoptionists in their argument. As said, the disagreement was also about when Jesus became the Son of God. The text of interest in this context is this one. And a voice came from heaven, "You are my Son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased." That's Mark 1:11 according to NIV. And NIV renders Luke 3:22, "You are my Son, whom I love. Which you I am well pleased. With you I am well pleased." But in an early Greek manuscript and various Latin ones, however, one finds this: "You are my Son. Today I have begotten you." That's according to an early Greek manuscript and late manuscripts, and also quotations from the church fathers. In fact, many church fathers quoted this text very often in the 2nd and the 3rd century. That is, at a time before most of the textual witnesses were written, which we have today. And what statement did they almost always quote? "Today I have begotten you." A second movement in the first Christians was the Docetism. Against the Docetism is the next part. That was a group of Christians that had the exact opposite view towards the adoptionism, which is called Docetism, and you can see it in Wikipedia. The name comes from the Greek word dokeo, which means to appear as something. And according to this, Jesus was fully and exclusively divine. So, the opposite. He only appeared to be a man because, as God, he could not also be a man. However, some copyists wanted to make sure that Jesus was very much a real man on earth. Therefore, they added the part about Jesus sweat like blood in Luke 22, 43 to 45, which we already have discussed a few minutes ago. We find another addition in the description of the Lord's Supper. We have mentioned it briefly before, but it's like this. After taking the cup, he gave thanks and said, "Take this and divide it among you. For I tell you, I will not drink again from the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes." And he took bread, gave thanks and broke it and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. But the hand of him who is going to betray me is with mine on the table." That's the NIV. The part which was crossed out is missing in one of the oldest Greek manuscripts and in some Latin textual witnesses. Typical of an alteration is the alignment with the account in 1 Corinthians 11, 23 to 25. And the resulting circumstance that this unexpectedly mentions 2 cups before and after the bread. Why the text was added can be seen, for example, in the writing of Tertullian against Marcion. It was emphasized that Jesus had a real body of flesh which was also sacrificed. But we don't want to go into that discussion about Marcion. We will do that later. Let's talk about a third group, and we can call them separationists. In the 2nd and 3rd century, there was another movement that we could call separationists, although this is not the common name for that. For them, there was Jesus, who was only human, as the adoptionists believed, as well as Christ, only divine, as in Docetism. This idea is often found also among the Gnostics of that time. We have already looked at one text that was changed to go against these ideas. It was Hebrews 2 verse 9. The idea that Jesus died apart from God and not by God's grace would have fit this ideal all too well. According to Irenaeus, Mark's gospel was the first choice of those who separated Jesus from Christ. Therefore, Mark 15:34 was changed this way. And at 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That's NIV. There is, however, solid evidence, e.g. in the Gospel of Philip, that some Gnostic groups interpreted this text very literally and considered it as the moment when the divine Christ separated from the human Jesus. Therefore, there are one Greek and several Latin manuscripts in which the copyist replaced the text with this, my God, why have you mocked me?" That was creative because in the account of Jesus' execution in Mark, almost everyone mocked him. But it is not in our earliest and best textual witnesses, nor does it fit the Aramaic text. We'll finally talk about how these differences are assessed. Now that we have considered a whole range of intentional changes to the text, the question arises of how to evaluate such changes and differences. Several criteria should be considered to assess how reliable a word, a text, or a passage is. And I have linked to an article in the forum in German, which goes into more detail. But to give us some idea how to do that, an overview and explanation of falsified text can be found also in another article. And we'll talk now about some of these criteria, a summary, which you can find in a 2001 translation. So when you read a manuscript, you should think about this. The words are missing from the prominent old manuscript, especially the great codices. An example is Matthew 6:13. So this is most of the time, a direct evidence that the words were not always accepted as genuine. Another question, another topic. The wording has different fundamental meanings in different manuscripts. An example is Acts 7:16. This suggests that there was no original to check against and could be common notes added by different people before being transposed into the text. See, the words jump around in different places in different manuscripts. An example is 1 Corinthians 14:33. This suggests that earlier copyists knew that they were unoriginal, so they copied them in different places as marginal notes until eventually different copyists transposed it into the text wherever they found it. There are also criteria that take into account the context. There is item D. The words are out of context and break the narrative. Example is Matthew 27 in 52 and 53. Original words would not do this, but later additions would. This by itself would not be enough evidence to declare a passage spurious. But you should take care. Item E. They say factually incorrect things or don't make sense. Example, 1 Corinthians 14:34. The original inspired writers could not make silly mistakes, but later persons inserting fake words could easily do so. Item F. The words reflect later dogmas that nobody believed at the time of the writing. For example, we have the Comma Johanneum, 1 John chapter 5 verses 7 to 8. An original writer would not say something that would require a time machine. And finally, item G, removing the words allows the passage to flow better or to make more sense. If a passage is spurious, removing it would make no difference or improve the text. Removing original words could break or worsen the passage, usually, but not always. So these were some criteria which are used to when differences are found and are analyzed. As we have already seen from some examples, the text of the manuscripts was unfortunately also intentionally changed. On the one hand, because it was thought that the text in the margin or between the lines had only been forgotten and in reality belonged to the original text after all. In a number of cases, however, the text was also intentionally changed in order to promote a certain doctrine or to prevent other interpretations. And this demonstrably happened as early as the 2nd century. Before that, we just don't know anything. So before mid-2nd century. Often the reason was to exclude Christians with other interpretations of the text as heretics. So if we now look back, now we're in part 7, and I look back on this sentence from the first part of the video series. The Bible is God's word, the Holy Scriptures, fully inspired by God and thus containing exactly what God intended. We have to strike through things if they are interpreted in a very generic way. It has been preserved for us to this day exactly as the Bible itself says so. Every book, paragraph, sentence, word, comma, and period. We saw now several examples that if you say this is 100% the case, this is not true. But even if, as one translator of the 2001 translation noted, even if we were sure of 99.9% of the text, that would still mean that there are about 150 errors lurking in the text. In fact, it might be difficult to give an estimate here. And what is even more important for our question, the overall question we had for this series, for the last 2000 years, all Christians have had a much, much worse text with many more errors than we have. So God has not perfectly preserved the original text, that is the autographs. On the other hand, we must not disproportionately interpret the facts and also what I just said. The facts prove that the extreme form of the statement cannot be held. But the facts also do not show that the text of the Christian scriptures is completely unreliable. And it is not at all about a binary statement. Do you believe that the text in the Bible is correct or not? Can you base your faith on it, or should you leave it alone altogether? So it's not black and white. The facts provide us with a better foundation. We can make statements about how reliable the text of the canon of Christian scriptures of the New Testament is. We do not make a blanket statement for the entire canon, but can determine, depending on the text, on the basis of the many textual witnesses, whether whether there were or are deviations, or whether none are known. When we think about a biblical text, the very first thing we should do is to check how reliable it has been handed down. Of course, a gap of many decades or even more remains between the autographs and the earliest manuscripts. What changes there may have been during this time, we cannot directly verify. Neither were hardly any or many. We are left only to weigh a few considerations and trust in the faithfuls of the patristic period and the early church fathers, who compared the text with each other and with the oral tradition, and created the canon of the Christian writings, the New Testament, as we will see in our next episode. Thank you very much for listening.